JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is a series in which a lot of thematic change happens, whether that's in story or in the real world. Hirohiko Araki would be a good definition for the embodiment of change. He's a mangaka that makes up plot lines as he goes along, makes up power systems as he's going along, dramatically changes story beats because he's just feeling it in the moment, and is always trying to throw a curveball at the audience. Again, this is JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, so the bizarre factor comes from the unknown. This unorthodox writing style has led to JoJo's success over the recent years and most of Araki's professional career. However, the byproduct of this very unorthodox writing style is the forgetting of past ideas, because in the pursuit of perfection or honing your craft, things will be forgotten. But why do I say any of this? Well, as of recently over on Patreon, I've been rewatching Phantom Blood for all of you guys to watch for free, up until I do part 2. And over the course of this rewatch, my love for Phantom Blood, and especially Hamon, have increased in recent days. So much so that now I've spiraled into making a video like this. So I present to you the forgetting of Hamon, from the highest of highs during parts 1 and 2 to the lowest of lows in the later half of the original universe, results in Araki's biggest mistake within JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Or was it? Because you could argue that maybe it wasn't his mistake, and maybe if given the opportunity, how could this be remedied? Oh, and by the way, hello, my name is Metas. Walk with me. So, if you didn't know, Hamon was not created with Phantom Blood in mind, in the sense that Hamon is a byproduct of Phantom Blood. See, Araki just wanted to make a family fight a generational evil, and that's it. That's the whole basis of part 1 and mostly of all of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. In doing so, and in the competitive sphere that is Shonen Jump, Araki needed to add a little bit of flavor in order to keep up with Fist of the North Star and Dragon Ball. So the idea of lightning karate and vampirism came through. And looking back at it in retrospect, this was of course the right call. Without these two powers, without the side of good versus the side of evil, using two very, very unique abilities that were inspired by Fist of the North Star, I will say that here and now, it helped JoJo's into the modern landscape years later. Looking at Hamon within Phantom Blood instead of the outside real world context, Hamon is a grounded but yet fun fighting style for the time back in the late 80s. Hell, even now, if I'm going to be personally honest with you, after rewatching it once again. The idea that rhythmic breathing can allow a human body to reach such a super state is genuinely pretty interesting to read. It is then further elevated by the fact that there are styles to it. A personal favorite of mine is Turquoise Blue Overdrive, which just allows any Hamon user to charge their Hamon through a liquid, and it doesn't stop there. Hamon provides something much more than fighting. It's implied much more in the anime than the manga, but Hamon has the ability to heal, symbolizing its role within nature as a positive force for good, reinforcing the fact that the Joestars, and in specific with Jonathan, as being the good guy. Looking past the surface level interpretation of all of that, we also have Deep Pass Overdrive, which kind of symbolizes the whole idea of what Phantom Blood is trying to set up for all of JoJo's. Older generations giving the power to the new ones to fight back, to overcome great struggle. While Hamon was not originally intended to be within Phantom Blood at the start of its publication, Araki did a very, very good job of setting it up to where you can't have Phantom Blood without Hamon, and you can't have Hamon without Phantom Blood. They are one in the same, because the core ideas and the use of Hamon coincide with the entire plot line of Phantom Blood. This is where vampiricism comes in. Being a vampire is innately bad, or at least the abilities that vampiricism gives you are bad. And just like Zappelli says, they are of the same coin. They can virtually do everything the same. However, the product of doing it requires the sacrifice of another versus one's own inherent willpower deep within themselves. Because of these abilities, it helps the audience understand that Phantom Blood is the idea of good versus evil and how they are intertwined with each other. One also could argue, by the way, that it is so intertwined that even a Hamon user using a inherently good ability can still be evil. Straight-so, for example, implying the fact that even a vampire could be a good guy even though his abilities are considered evil. I think by now you kind of get why Hamon was so important in Phantom Blood. There is a lot of thematic substance within just a power system, which I'm going to argue Hamon was always more about the thematic weight rather than the actual action of the power system itself. However, we have a problem, and one of the more major downsides of Hamon start to show up here. When Araki meant grounded for the Hamon power system, he meant scientific, or at least vaguely realistic to what could happen in real life, which I don't even ask me how that makes any sense. Hamon has the ability to see into the future. Dog, what the do you mean science? So because of that very stupid limiting that early Araki or young Araki did to himself, Hamon in part 2 is much more stylized, but doesn't really try to evolve Hamon past what it was in part 1. We see through Joseph it's used in more battle IQ ways, while in Caesar's case we see a much more unique showing of how to conduct Hamon through bubbles, or through Lisa and her mastery of it, allowing her to conduct it through really anything, in specific very conductible Hamon fabrics to make weapons out of. Interesting, but very bland in retrospect. Mind you, this is also the same part that introduced the Hamon clan and the ultimate life form's ability to make superheated Hamon on touch. So it's really weird that we didn't get any further elaboration or further powers from Hamon. And you can definitely tell it's because, of course, Araki was limiting himself with what Hamon should be rather than what it could be. Oddly enough, it's worsened by the fact that vampires kind of get buffed in this part. Not exactly, but at least the idea of them. The Pillarmen are just supposed to be stronger vampires with even more unique abilities. So why doesn't Hamon get that? Caesar kind of gets that buff, but what about Lisa and Joseph? They really don't. They're kind of just, for the most part, using standard Hamon, elevated by their own personal styles. So where are their cool buffs? Because of this box that Araki imposes on himself, this is where the birth of stands comes in, and where part 3 changes pretty dramatically from parts 1 and 2. At this point in Araki's mangaka career, he's really focusing more on style and fighting rather than thematics. This is ultimately seen as stands are more individualistic for the character they're representing than the grander part, which, I'm gonna say this now, is good. That self-imposed box that he put around Hamon has been utterly solved thanks to stands. It was the right move. I'm not saying stands are bad as a power system. I think actually out of all the power systems in JoJo, stands are by far my favorite. But it's how Hamon is treated in part 3 and moving on forward is where I think Araki makes his biggest blunder. In the previous 2 parts, there is this idea of passing on Hamon, or the idea of being a hero to the next generation from person to person. First starting off with William to Jonathan, then to Jonathan to George to Lisa to Lisa slash Speedwagon, I'll give him his credit there, to Joseph. However, in part 3, there really isn't a moment of that. Jojo just kind of becomes the hero. Now, that's of course because of his nature, which kind of fits in with the whole themes of stands and how they just kind of showed up. But up until this point, that was kind of the tradition, to pass on the title of hero from one to another through the miracle, or depending if you're Erina, the curse of Hamon. And that being the case, you would think that Araki would send off the last of the Hamon power system, or the last of the JoJo Hamon users, off with a bang, or at least a good showing within part 3. You clicked on this video, you knew exactly it wasn't gonna go like that. Hamon in part 3 is piss poor. Old Joseph frankly sucks using his Hamon. He barely ever uses it. And when it comes to the end of part 3, I low-key believe where Dio is explaining to Joseph that Hamon is just this thing of the past is not actually Dio saying it, but Araki through Dio is saying it. Note, I might be looking too into that, but it genuinely feels like that. Hamon in part 3 feels near non-existent. It doesn't actually have any weight in the story like it did previously, even though we're dealing with a vampire, which, mind you, is a direct opposite to Hamon and its life energy. Even on that note, Dio's vampiricism is very non-existent in this part, other than the regeneration, which it does somewhat have a valid excuse, but you can definitely tell that Araki was trying to move away from vampiricism and Hamon by the end of part 3. And moving on from part 3 into parts 4, 5, and 6, it becomes non-existent. While there is subtle callbacks to the original parts, Hamon is rarely ever mentioned, if not at all. Funny enough, vampiricism gets more crumbs than Hamon did after part 3. So with that done and dusted and being left in the ruins of parts 1 and 2 and its Hamon and vampiricism, what is there left to say? You want my honest opinion? I don't think Araki wanted to. While Araki's nature is that of change and becoming better over time, mastering your craft, and by the product of that, things are forgotten, is not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, in the context of what he wanted Hamon to be, it was limiting. Stands were needed. However, that's only because of the environment he was in. A limited power system is okay. Fist of the North Star is very simple to understand when it comes to its power system with the divine Fist of the North Star and the South Star. But in order to keep up with Shonen Jump, things have to change. Things have to be exciting, intriguing to the audience to keep engaged with your manga. And Hamon, sadly, at that time just didn't keep up. It wasn't interesting enough to Araki, therefore it wasn't interesting enough for the fans. And while yes, I think Araki could have solved that Hamon issue during part 2 given enough time, that isn't possible within Shonen Jump. It is extremely cutthroat and is so fast-paced as a company that it drains you. We later see this within part 5 and Araki's mental state there. Honestly, the changing from Hamon to stands was a massive gamble. Araki first showed his editors what he wanted to do with JoJo's with a new power system, and they were utterly confused. So Araki was in some very dangerous territory. However, it did pay off thanks to the infinitely more creative powers that could come from it rather than Hamon, even if you could elevate it by adding new styles or weird little quirks to it. It's still at the end of the day lightning karate and physical to physical matchups, while stands can do all of that and more. So there is a clear winner when it comes to which power system is better for the longevity of JoJo's. But that doesn't mean they couldn't simultaneously work together, and that's what Araki thought. Araki was forced to forget or not even look at Hamon when moving on from part 3. That's just the nature of Shonen Jump. However, when Araki was freed and went to Ultra Jump to work on Steel Ball Run, we can see that Araki still cared for his previous parts, because he did want to remake parts 1, 2, and 3. Steel Ball Run borrows the previous ideas in the original universe and remakes them into something brand new thanks to Araki's experience. You can clearly see that through the evolution of Hamon evolving into the spin, something that works in tandem with stands and still elevates the story to even a higher degree like Hamon originally did back in Phantom Blood. So when Araki is given time to think and use his experience over the long mangaka career he's had, he's an absolute demon. And unlike the original universe, the SBR verse is still using the spin up until part 8. We haven't seen anything in part 9, but seeing that there is a track record with the last 2 parts, that being Steel Ball Run and Jojolion, I actually will say that it will probably appear in part 9 in some fashion. Maybe Jodio's brain droplets will spin or something, who knows. But with me, it leads me down an interesting path and a question I have to ask you guys. If Araki were to keep Hamon within parts 1 through 6 without changing the story too dramatically, how could that be done? Now, my first idea isn't too complicated. While it's small, it still heavily dramatically changes the story, at least in some avenues, but it isn't really too crazy after part 3. That being, Hamon and stands are more connected than we originally thought. In order to produce Hamon, or the Ripple, one must master Sendo. In doing that, you can produce the Ripple or Hamon through your body. Stand users can do the exact same thing, but subconsciously. However, it's not through physically breathing, but controlling one's brain ripples or brain waves in order to manifest a stand. As stands are based off of psychic energy, looking at some data book guides and what Araki has said in the past. More or less, stand users are mental Sendo users. Now, I need to mention this, technically that is maybe true. It's been a fan theory for a very long time, looking at the kanji for Sendo / Hamon to stand, is that they are very similar, and so a lot of people have predicted this is actually true or how it should work. However, Araki's never explained it, so it's always been kind of like headcanon / in theory territory. The only reason why I bring it up as a solution is it's the only thing that could retroactively bridge a lot of the stuff in the past without rewriting anything. So if a guidebook were to ever come out basically confirming that idea, it ultimately would solidify Hamon being a lot more connected to the other 4 parts in the original universe. Now, if the Sendo brainwave thing is not your style, we can move on to individually kind of putting Hamon in every part in which it doesn't take place in, which I think is ultimately fair too, but it wouldn't be so crazy that it would change the story. So starting with part 3, I would only implement 2 things here. One, there are more vampires and ghouls that Joseph would have to personally fight using his Hamon to defeat. Give more screen time to Hamon in this fashion before it officially leaves at the end of part 3. It's simple and sweet, and I think it works. On top of that, I would actually say that Joseph at some point in the story gives a comment to Jojo saying he does have Hamon potential, but the time constraint is too limiting that he couldn't teach him. On top of the fact that Star Platinum is just overpowered and wouldn't need to teach him, which is Joseph code for I'm too lazy to teach you Hamon, which I think is honestly pretty funny. So moving into Diamond is Unbreakable, something similar to the last point happens here. Old Joseph actually looks at Josuke and kind of makes a comment to where Crazy Diamond's restoration ability is similar to Hamon healing, at least in some fashion. I'm just gonna chalk something up saying like back in part 2 when Joseph got heavily injured during a fight, Lisa healed him through Hamon, and he's just remembering that through Josuke. Also, he can potentially make a comment saying since he was so gifted with Hamon, it would also make sense why Josuke would also have at least some dormant potential of Hamon as well. But since Joseph is way too old to teach him, Josuke's restoration powers and Crazy Diamond's physical abilities are more than enough for Morio, so Hamon isn't needed. I would also say, just like the previous point, how you can also interpret this as the old guard, the Hamon guard, giving the hero title to the new generation of stand users to guard the world from evil, also plays out here as well, but instead of Joseph being lazy like previously, he's just too old to teach it. Now, going into Golden Wind, you would think this would be really difficult to somehow put Hamon, or at least the idea of Hamon, within part 5, but it's really not. Now, the only person that would be able to say this would be the narrator directly talking to us, and that's in Giorno's backstory. Either super directly or at least implied, the author would say something like Giorno's gold experience's life energy is similar to Jonathan's Hamon and how it was able to create life just like Jonathan did back in part 1 after being punched by Zappelli. Either that or maybe one of the side characters, I don't know, like Mista or like Bruno says Giorno has this like ripple like aura to him, could work as well, but past that, I think that's fine. I think that's the most you could do with Hamon in part 5, or at least try to subtly put it into the story. Now, Stone Ocean has a really cool moment here that I would actually place towards the end of the story with Jotaro and Jolene. After Jotaro saves Jolene, I would actually say to some degree that Jotaro makes a comment about how Stone Free and Hermit Purple seem very similar to each other, but that Jolene and Stone Free are leagues above Joseph in terms of strength and standability, and that Jotaro is impressed of what she's been able to do without him being there. So really sweet. But during the last fated encounter between Jolene and Pucci, Jolene uses her dormant Hamon potential from generations long past. Because if Pucci gets to throw knives in a reference to Dio, I'm giving Jolene Hamon against him in the final fight, and maybe even landing a few blows or two, making him exhausted before the final encounter with Emporio. I don't care, it works, it makes sense. I don't know why there was not any grander nostalgia bait trip to Jonathan during that last fight. It pisses me off to this day, it's fine, it's okay, but that's what I would do to subtly put Hamon back into part 6. I guess in retrospect, that part wasn't subtle, but you get it. Looking back on it, I don't think Araki ever wanted to forget about Hamon. It was never the original intention, but the environment around him forced him to evolve, slowly putting in the back burner until he could never use it again. Was it partially his fault for limiting himself? Maybe, but I wouldn't really say it was entirely his fault. It was just a simple mistake that I can thankfully say that he tries to at least repair within the SBR universe, and maybe even during part 3, but at least very subtly. So with that all being said, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Patreon, stay hydrated, and I will see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Deuces.